destitute beginnings in Jamaica. He created one of the most feared drug gangs in American history. He is responsible for thousands of deaths. His impact is felt even today in the continuing war against drugs. Lester Coke created an empire built on fear. In the annals of organized crime, violence is not uncommon. Brutality is often a tradition, with origins that can be traced back centuries. In the 1980s, however, a new crime organization took hold. Born of the drug trade and unrestrained by ancient custom, the Shower Posse brought havoc not only to its native Jamaica, but across the United States as well. At the top of the organization stood the most feared posse don of them all, Lester Lloyd Coke. In less than a decade, Lester Coke's Shower Posse rose from obscurity in the political unrest of Jamaica to prominence as one of the most feared drug gangs in American history. And in that same decade, the FBI, the DEA, and the ATF fought together in an unprecedented battle to bring down Lester Coke, and in doing so, raised the stakes in a widening war against drugs. To most, Jamaica is a vacation paradise, the birthplace of reggae music, a land of unique art and culture. The qualities that bring millions of tourists to the island make it an enchanting destination. But there's another Jamaica, a complicated land with a tragic past. This was the Jamaica that created Lester Lloyd Coke. Coke grew up in Tivoli Gardens, a poor community on the outskirts of the Jamaican capital of Kingston. His early life was spent in this cramped tenement yard. As many as 10 families lived here, each limited to a single room, with the entire building sharing one bathroom. He came from the world of the sufferers, those sharing a life of extreme poverty and desperation.
Well, the typical childhood of a sufferer youth in Jamaica is a very frightening one, in the sense that many of that generation was simply not able to have access to high schools. I mean, their schooling would end at the age of 14 or 15. It would mean then that just housing would be a serious problem. Getting food on a daily basis would be a serious problem. Many of these people depended on remittances coming from abroad. I mean, that really sometimes determined whether they survived or did not survive. And of course, growing up in those communities with the level of violence, you really had to be tough in order to survive, and just very difficult to survive if you didn't develop a certain inner toughness.
While researching for her book on Jamaican posses, author Laurie Gunst became intimately familiar with the people and the spirit of Jamaica.
I came to realize that the main sound that I remembered from Kingston's ghettos was the sound of children crying. It is really weeping and wailing and crying that I remember most of all from those streets. That and the hot sun beating down and the hunger. It's a destitution that is almost impossible for an American to understand, because in this country we always have hope. It's a huge country. There's always another frontier. There's always a place to go. In Jamaica, there's nowhere to go unless you can escape from the rock, unless you're one of the tiny lucky few who have a visa and can get to the United States. Otherwise, for you, there will be no hope.
Like so many of his generation, young Lester Coke found hope in American movies, captivated by the interracial embrace between actors Jim Brown and Raquel Welch in the 1969 movie 100 Rifles. Coke would adopt the film star's name. In Tivoli Gardens, he was the new Jim Brown.
I don't know him as Jim Brown. I know him as Bye-Bye, because that's the name we called him when he was a little boy going to school.
The boy that Taylor Egbert Edwards knew as Bye-Bye offered no hint of his future path.
Never see you fight a boy. I never see him do nothing at all. I know him as a clean man. I used to make his pants when he was a little boy, going to school. So we was associate when he was a small boy, quite nice youth, grew with us, and milk lane.
Brown began to learn a trade. He was a welder, a cabinet maker, and a locksmith. His neighbors saw him as a good, hard-working young man, a man looking for an opportunity. But in time, his ambition would lead him to a criminal career, achieving for him the dream of many of the poor in Jamaica, the freedom to escape.
The Jamaican people have had a very difficult history. It's a history that is rooted in slavery and in colonialism. But the Jamaican people are also very imaginative, very creative, very aggressive, and very willing to resist oppression. One of the unique features about slavery in Jamaica is that almost every 5 years there was a major rebellion. And I think that there is something in the Jamaican spirit that makes us willing to resist oppression. Now, that might manifest itself in different forms.
What you have in Jamaica is a third world democracy struggling to accommodate itself to a very harsh reality, which is extreme poverty of the majority and the very great wealth of the very, very few. That's not a situation in which democracy thrives.
In 1962, the world was on the brink of a third world war when Soviet missiles were placed on Cuban territory. In a tense showdown, the United States demanded their immediate removal. Finally, the Soviet Union acquiesced. From then on, the United States considered the entire Caribbean an important frontier in the East-West struggle.
So what happened was that Jamaica began to be drawn into the orbit of this struggle, and her politics polarized accordingly. So that by the time Michael Manley became Prime Minister in 1972 and articulated socialism as the path his People's National Party was going to follow, and Edward Seaga emerged as the leader of the Jamaica Labour Party, and he was a significant force on the right side, that is the right-wing side. Politics in Jamaica polarized very sharply along these two lines. And that meant that as far as the ghettos were concerned, there was going to be increasing polarization between the two parties and increasing violence, as both sides enlisted their paladins, their gunfighters, to control vast areas of Kingston's ghetto downtown.
Basil Wilson, provost of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, has written extensively on the political history of his native Jamaica.
And one of the things that emerged is a battle for scarce resources. So the party in power tended to build low-income housing and distributed that housing to their supporters. And politicians vying for power would politicize particular communities, be able to provide those communities with contracts, with low-income housing, with other niceties of government. And I think that led to highly politicized communities where elections then became a life and death struggle.
And the level of this warfare is almost impossible for an American to understand because it involves strategies and tactics such as burning people out of their homes. If there's an area that's known to be packed with supporters of one party and you're in the other party and you want to unseat them, you simply torch that neighborhood by night and shoot at the firemen as they're trying to put out the blaze. And when the blaze is over, you bulldoze the rubble and build a housing scheme, as it's called in Jamaica, a housing project, and you pack it full of your own supporters. Because the construction trades in Jamaica were so corrupt and were so tied into the politicians, and because the tribal warfare downtown often consisted of burning out entire neighborhoods in downtown Kingston, the contractor had a particularly lucrative tie to the two political parties, because when you were a contractor and an area was burnt out and needed to be rebuilt, if you had ties to a politician, you would be the one he would call. So Jim Brown had come up fairly well in West Kingston by the mid-1970s. He was a well-known figure in Tivoli Gardens, which is Seaga's constituency in West Kingston. He was actually a contractor, and he was very much an up-and-coming enforcer. He wanted to get involved as Seaga's right-hand man, and he was pushing himself up through the ranks of West Kingston gunmen.
Politics is the key thing, factor. This is because we stand up for one thing. You had forces that tried to fight that and give it a hard fight though. And we had to make sure we keep those forces out.
Devin Clark was born on Milk Lane, the same street where Jim Brown spent his early years.
You definitely have to have somebody to make the place where it is. Where you can sleep with the door open, you can't do anything at all like that. And that was the kind of man he is.
What was happening on the streets downtown in Kingston was a growing fascination with the Hollywood silver screen, and primarily the outlaws and cowboys and bandits that came out of Hollywood in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. All of these movies really captured the Jamaican imagination. And the gangsters, who were by then up and coming in the ranks of both parties, began to style themselves after these cowboy heroes. And that became the real kind of emotional substance that the gangs carried to Kingston's poor.
In 1980, a pivotal national election in Jamaica was a culmination of the political unrest that had shaken the foundations of its government. The radical divisions between Michael Manley and Edward Seaga led to disaster.
The 1980 election in Jamaica was a bloodbath in which perhaps as many as 1,000 people lost their lives. The level of terror in 1980 was unlike anything Jamaicans had ever experienced before. Anybody who had a grudge to settle in Kingston or anywhere else in the island hoped to get themselves recruited. Most of the gunmen wanted to fire shots for the Jamaica Labour Party because it was already well known by that time that the Jamaica Labour Party was the one favored by the United States and the CIA.
As expected, Edward Seaga and his Jamaican Labour Party were swept into power, a power that extended to one of his strongest supporters, Jim Brown. With Seaga's victory, Brown emerged not only as his bodyguard, but as a leader in Tivoli Garden.
So that when the election was over, what you had was victorious gunmen, of whom Jim Brown was the most important. He emerged at the top of the heap after 1980, and losing gunmen on the PNP side, who got the message very quickly that they had better get out of the island if they wanted to live. So that was really, it was the 1980 election in Jamaica that initiated the exodus of the posses to the United States. Because once that election was over, there was only room in Jamaica for a few of the victorious posse dons. It was only the ones at the very top of the heap who were very closest to Seaga, who were going to really be able to parlay the work they had done for Seaga in the 1980 election into continuing a lucrative life.
Though Jim Brown, as Don of Tivoli Gardens, was already earning a reputation as a man to be feared, he was still considered a hero to his followers. To them, he was living the Hollywood screen legend of the American West, the lone, misunderstood gunman, achieving good against all odds.
He was a person who decided to stand up for the cause of the community. He put himself forward, he sacrificed himself for that, for we in the community.
The Don would be synonymous with that of a grandfather. The Don basically is the leader within the community. He provides the protection, and he tends to be a major figure.
A champion, yes. Champion, because he was a champion for the people. For the people in West Kingston. He respect the people, and the people them give him the same amount of respect. I will love that, you know.
As much as law enforcement will look at the Dons as being criminals, within the community, the Dons are seen as leaders, as community activists, as people who provide the community with certain basic necessities. So I think you have an interesting contradiction there as to who is looking at the Don and who is interpreting what the Don is doing, and whether the Don is benefiting the community or is in fact being detrimental to the community.
A good man, but if it comes to the test, you know, a good man can turn.
Several things happened to Jim Brown after the 1980 election. One of them was that as Seaga's bodyguard, he had what was basically diplomatic immunity. He could shuttle back and forth with Seaga or on his own between Jamaica and the United States. The other thing was that after 1980, Ronald Reagan was in the White House, and America really stepped up its war on drugs abroad. In the case of Jamaica, what this meant was American military and USAID funding for ganja, marijuana eradication in Jamaica, and it became increasingly difficult for Jamaicans to get their product off the island. So men like Jim Brown, who had contacts with politicians, who had contacts on the wharves in West Kingston, which are within the area that Seaga controls, became crucially important to Jamaica's growers because they could no longer attempt to get their drugs off the island. What Jim Brown did was to basically leapfrog the Jamaican marijuana connection into the United States using his connections in Miami, Toronto, Washington, D.C., New York, and Los Angeles, and keep the money flowing in to Jamaica's growers, for whom marijuana was the only game in town. It was Jamaica's only cash crop.
This was a real story of Jim Brown and his criminal organization, called the Shower Posse. With a shower of ammunition posse members would unleash against rivals. They began as brutal enforcers of political will. They would soon be ruled by an even greater force, a worldwide demand for illegal drugs. The Shower Posse entered the U.S. narcotics trade at a critical time. Usage was at an all-time high, and the drug war in the United States, though heavily funded and widely promoted, continued to be ineffective.
The Shower Posse, by any other name, had really resolved itself into an entity by the time of the 1980 election. Jim Brown was already at the helm as Seaga's bodyguard. He was the top-ranking enforcer in Kingston. But it really wasn't until after the election when all of these gangsters on both sides, all of what Jamaicans call the friars, the small chickens, were basically skittering out of Jamaica to try to make their fortunes in the United States, that Jim Brown saw that the real money lay up here in the burgeoning crack cocaine trade.
Jim Brown, along with his second-in-command Vivian Blake, already had connections in New York, Washington, and Miami to make the Shower Posse an important force in the sale of crack cocaine.
Jamaican sort of storefront operations sold marijuana, reggae records, vegetarian food. Vivian Blake and Jim Brown saw that they could parlay these connections in Jamaican communities across the country into very lucrative crack cocaine trade. At the same time, they also had their own Jamaican product, marijuana, that they could sell. And what basically happened by the time crack hit the streets in the United States was that the drug lords, the Colombians, particularly the Cali cartel, which had a special relationship with the Shower Posse. It's been said that the Cali cartel handpicked Jim Brown and the Shower to be its street-level middlemen in the United States.
The Colombian cartels, in a lot of cases, in certain cities, have better market penetration than Burger King. It's if you don't believe me, ask any cop. Ask the next cop you see. He will tell you that he can find drugs or drug users or drug dealers probably within a few blocks of where you're standing right at that very moment.
They were bolder than the rest. They had come from an island, it must be remembered, in which the police force routinely commits between 1/3 and 1/2 of the island's homicides. That's a staggering total when you think about it. So these were gangsters who were perfectly willing to violate the most important rule that the underworld has ever known, which is don't kill cops. Jamaicans do not abide by that rule. They were perfectly willing to kill police officers, and they were perfectly willing to shoot anybody who was in the way. They thrived on violence, and they were quite willing to use it, and this made them ideal street-level enforcers.
Jim Brown and the Shower Posse were thriving. In Jamaica, he was at the height of his power. When the neighboring community of Rima posed a threat, it was Brown who led a reprisal raid in which 12 people were murdered. Though there was a public outcry, he was never brought to justice. Instead, the government seemed to expand his ability to move freely to and from Jamaica. For Brown, business was good. Crack cocaine usage had grown to epidemic proportions in the United States. Law enforcement so far was ineffective. The body count attributed to Shower Posse violence continued to rise.
According to the United Nations, the drug market internationally is somewhere around $400 billion a year, which puts it ahead of the oil business and slightly behind the arms trade as number 2 in the top 3 industries.